Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today as we join to support Inga and Emma and Alita and Bernie and all of Glenn's extended family as we remember Glenn, who passed away just over 3 months ago. I know that many of you were able to be, or some of you were able to be in Michigan for the funeral in February, but not everyone was. As you know, the Cantor family has a very wide, extended family. So we're grateful to all of you who traveled a distance to be here with us today. Some of you I have known for a long, long time, but many of you I have not had the chance to meet before. I'm Rabbi Molly Wiesel, a rabbi here at Temple B'nai Torah. In the world of music, there's one symphony which has hit the world differently from all the rest. The conventional symphony has 3, 4, sometimes even 5 movements, but there's a famous symphony, Symphony No. 8, which was composed by Franz Schubert, that has only 2 movements. There's much debate in the world about this 2-part symphony. Many people argue that he intended for it to be a 4-part symphony, but was never able to complete it before his death. Hence the other name that it's also known by, the Unfinished Symphony. Someone came along claiming that before Schubert's death, he had given him a copy of the full symphony as a 5-part symphony, and that this person claimed to hold the only known copy of the missing movements. This led to some backlash from people who thought he was lying, and another group of people emerged claiming that actually this was not an unfinished symphony, but this was a complete symphony because all along Schubert actually intended for it to be a 2-part symphony. Franz Schubert was a prolific composer who gave the world a lot of music, but when his life was unexpectedly cut short, I think that this debate ensued precisely because he had been so accomplished. He gave so much to the world. He was so full of life. And I think there was an overwhelming sense that he had more to give. Symphony No. 8 may be an unfinished symphony, leaving us with the sense that there could have been more. But it is nonetheless considered by the world to be a masterpiece. And so too, on February 16th, Glenn's life was unexpectedly cut short. And yet Glenn's life was certainly a masterpiece. He and Inga shared 43 years of marriage together. They raised 2 wonderful daughters and were able to share in the joy of welcoming some wonderful grandchildren into the world who are here today. Spending time with his loving family was the most important thing to Glenn. And with his large extended family, he was close to his siblings, their partners, his many cousins, nieces, and nephews, many of you here today. The canvas of Glenn's life is also filled with the satisfaction of a long, enriching career as a research scientist and his insatiable love of nature, which we will hear more about from some of Glenn's relatives and friends and colleagues in just a few moments. Glenn was able to spend time doing what he loved, surrounded by the people that he loved. It is unbearably hard to lose someone so suddenly, especially when it was someone like Glenn, so full of life. But the way that he lived his life, the way that he impacted the people around him, the good that he did in this world, especially through his work, all of those things carry on. And so too, Glenn's life continues to be a blessing for all of us. Today we're going to hear from a few loved ones in our service, and then after we finish our service, everyone's invited to the social hall for a wonderful meal. And during that time, we'll also have the opportunity to sort of open the mic for anyone who wants to have the chance to share some memories or talk about things you loved about Glenn. We're going to start today by inviting up Glenn's wife, Inga, who has a special poem that she's going to share.
Well, first of all, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming today. It's just amazing that so many of you are here from all over the world, really. We have people here from Holland and Canada and all over the United States, and it's just so incredible to see you all here. And all I can think of is that Glenn would have just loved to have been here, and he would have come to each and every one of you and come up and talk to you and been anxious to hear about everything that you were doing, and he would have been so happy to be here today. So in his memory, that's why I wanted to have this, so that we can all remember the wonderful person that he was. And he was really into Dutch poetry. That's my niece, or my cousin from Holland, and they know that in Holland, for special occasions, you always write silly poems, and Glenn just loved to do that. So when he died, I wrote a special poem for him that kind of summarizes our life together. And I know I read it before, but I'm going to read it again. The Michigan State Vet School was where I first met Glenn, sitting on the grass with a broken leg and an attitude quite zen, and looking at me clearly with a dove wing in his hand. He said, "I know where your poncho's made, in the Ecuadorian land." Then talking to him further, with no feelings of regret, I thought, this is the strangest man that I have ever met. So shortly after vet school, at a Boy Scout camp we wed. There were musicians and a contra dance, and daisies on my head. In Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, some days were a battle, as we wrestled sheep, goats, horses, and giant dairy cattle. And while in private practice one fine October morn, the greatest of all happenings, our Alida was born. But after some time, Glenn decided that cows were not enough. He wanted to go back to school to learn some other stuff. Then off he went to Florida to study vet pathology, to look at gross anatomy and learn about histology. He studied hard in Gainesville amongst gators, ants, and snakes, till his mentor moved to Washington, so we pulled up all our stakes. We were off to Pullman, Washington to learn about anemia, to study T cells and lymphocytes for a PhD in bovine leukemia. And there amongst the wheat fields, in a quite dramatic way, our dearest Emma came into the world on a Cougar football day. So everybody was cheering for her. We could hear all the cheers outside the window. But Glenn still wanted more from life to further the field of oncology. So he joined the pharmaceutical world to learn more about toxicology. And so we moved to New Jersey, where he worked for BMS. There he researched drugs for cancer and hepatitis C, no less. He always loved Alaska, and their praises he did laud when his brother and sister-in-law took time to run Iditarod. He joined the veterinary team to help out with the race. He loved the little checkpoint towns, and the cold he did embrace. He developed Waldenstrom's disease, but did it slow him down? No, never. He joined the IWMF board and worked with scientists quite clever. He always loved the outdoors. He loved to hike and camp. He'd ski down any mountain or through the woods go tramp. So when it came time to retire, with no signs of trepidation, we moved to Bend, Oregon, known for outdoor recreation. But Glenn could not retire, no. To do so would be insulting. So he started his own company to do some path consulting. But now he had more free time. So as you've probably heard, he decided on a new hobby, the photography of the bird. He'd scour the sewage treatment ponds for goldeneyes or teal, and in search of woodpecker species, tromp through newborn woods with zeal. He spent hours fixing photographs, and who am I to judge? He even joined a camera club in Alaska's Anchorage. But more than anything in this world, he loved his family, from brothers, sisters, cousins, all the members of the tree. He loved his family in Holland, and though he didn't have the touch, he recently had started learning to speak Dutch. He loved his nieces and nephews and all their kids galore. He'd read and tell them stories. Oh, those kids he did adore. And he loved to be a grandpa to Sophie, Max, and Lily. He might read from Science magazine or tell them something silly. He was so proud of their accomplishments, of everything they do or make. He was anxiously awaiting the first steps that Sophie'd take. And so we gather here today with no words of second guessing to honor Glenn and his full life. May his memory be a blessing. And so I really want to thank everybody for coming today. I really can't tell you how much I appreciate each and every one of you being here. And I love you, Glenn, and I'm going to miss you terribly, but I'll never forget you. So thank you, everybody.
I'd like to invite up one of Glenn's siblings, Mark, to share some reflections as well.
Can't believe I'm up here memorializing my brother today. While I was preparing for this, I was thinking of my grandmother, Tilly, who passed away when I was 10. And she was 68 years old. And my memory is she was so old. And Glenn, we lost him at 70. And just, I'm struck by the contrast. He was so young. Glenn was at the top of his game. Glenn was not supposed to be the next one of us to go. I'm Mark Cantor. Glenn's my older brother, older by 10 years. And that was a big 10 years when we were both young. Glenn went away to college when I was 7. There were years after that when I didn't see him much. But of course, I do have many childhood memories of him. And this is the way I remember young Glenn. Glenn was fully formed. His essence was set at a very young age. And that essence of Glenn remained unchanged, unchanging, until he left us 3.5 months ago. Glenn could not care less about the things he didn't care about. And he cared deeply about the things he did care about. Glenn, even when young, did not care about fashion, pop culture, money, spectator sports, team sports. Glenn, even when young, cared deeply about discovery, about truth, education. He was a youthful liberal in the best sense of the word, pushing political causes, the environment, participating in the first Earth Day. He was a born naturalist from the get-go. He cared about science, photography, camping. Photography, not actually a new hobby. He was a young photographer too. Maybe he gave it up for a while. And he cared about nature, not simply to be experienced and to be enjoyed, but to be understood, to be conquered intellectually. He cared deeply about his own productivity. He always believed being busy was a virtue and being idle was a crime. He used those words. Glenn did not waste time. As a child, he was a collector, organizing great displays of insects and butterflies and rocks. His collections were fastidiously organized and labeled and presented. And Glenn, even when young, wanted to understand the scientific world. He wanted to understand the human condition. I remember a time when he was young, during the tail end of high school, when he was hot on the topic of phatic expression. the linguistic topic. Of course, neither I nor he knew the term phatic expression, which is conversational filler, when people exchange unnecessary, untrue, or irrelevant information for no reason other than to advance social bonds. An example, how are you? I clearly recall him going on and on about this, presenting the issue, his concerns, his thoughts regarding various potential responses to this question. Glenn couldn't just say, I am fine. Glenn couldn't just accept this social convention. He was compelled to question it, to understand it. Glenn was compelled to understand everything. Later in life, Glenn told me that when he was in the early part of high school, he would regularly spend time speaking about economics with my grandfather, a professor and the chair of the economics department of Wayne State University. And that time spent with my grandfather was formative, and it led to him having the intention, he told me, of becoming an economics professor. His beliefs regarding the value of education and his interest in being a professor obviously stuck. But he already had the bug regarding biology, the study of natural things, and as we know, he basically spent the rest of his life involved in that pursuit in one way or another. It wasn't all science and nature, though. Glenn had all sorts of sometimes surprising interests. He was an amateur automobile mechanic. When he was a young man, he owned a Volkswagen Beetle. Remember those? He did all of the mechanical work himself, not just the easy stuff like the timing belt and the oil changes. I remember him taking apart the carburetor and stripping the engine down to work on the pistons and the crankshaft. It was apparently pretty handy. I think that led to a series of different Volkswagens over the years. Maybe it was just one, and he just kept patching him up. Another one of his unexpected interests, his poetry. As you've heard, Glenn embraced the Eriks family long-standing tradition of writing poetry for special events and holidays. I don't know where his talent came from. I am unaware of anyone else in my family ever writing poetry. Wait, actually, maybe the Golubs. Got a few Golubs here. But other than that, no one in the Cantors ever wrote poetry, and it seemed to me contrary to Glenn's image as a man of science. But there it is. He wrote poems like crazy. He taught his children to write poems. There are countless examples of his poetry written for all manner of celebrations. And I would like to read one, which Inga shared with me a few weeks ago. And I will tell you in advance, it's poignant. It's kind of beautiful to hear. It's also kind of painful. And this is Glenn's last poem, written in celebration of his snowmobile trip to Alaska, comprising 17 stanzas. I'm only going to read a few to remember my brother, the poet, my brother, the adventurist. It's time once again for the Motorhead's trip. On Snow Machines Rapid, we ride at a brisk clip. What route should we take this year? By golly, the decision was made along the highway Denali. We'll go 67 miles across ridges and crest to the Alpine Creek Lodge, a place we know best. It's open terrain, windswept, hard to steer, with spectacular views when the weather is clear. And when visibility is not clear at all through the clouds and the fog, we still carry on, we push onwards, though it can be quite a slog. The Motorheads are a club quite venerable. Now many are septuagenarians. Born long ago in ancient times, we're like primitive flatworms, the planarians. You know Glenn delighted in that line. And in a Homeric way, the next 5 stanzas describe more expected experiences. I'm going to skip over those. The poem continues. Keep an eye out for animals like herds of caribou, huge beasts in the snow, lined up tight in a queue. At times in the bushes, there are flocks of tall, sharp-tailed grouse. They stretch their necks and leap in the air to eat birch catkins, not Scouse. So in the poem, the grouse are eating the catkins, and the catkins is the proper name for a type of flower produced by certain types of trees. They do not eat the scouse, which is a type of stew from northern England, from Liverpool. Nice, Glenn. Nice. I'm going to skip over the next two stanzas and just the big finish. And of course, don't forget the follies, full of talent and jokes and amusement. The only rule, and it's a strict one, is that all must participate, no excusement. I have just a few more comments. In the Jewish Torah in Deuteronomy, Moses summarizes the teachings of God. And in the course of his discourse, Moses asserts the importance of always choosing life. Now, Glenn was not a religiously observant man, but he carried with him, among others, this foundational Jewish value. And more than almost anyone I have ever known, Glenn was a person who actively chose life. I heard him say it on multiple occasions in a variety of circumstances, how important it was that everyone choose life and longevity. He was mortified when my 92-year-old mother, at the very end of her life, expressed that she was ready to go. And candidly, this always struck me as counterintuitive. I would have assumed that a self-described skeptical optimist, a scientist, a rationalist, would not be bothered by the end of life. Yet Glenn thought everyone should always, always choose life. There exists, however, a contradictory notion, and that is, leave when you are on top. Leave them wanting more. As painful as it is for me, and as painful as it is for all of us, that's what Glenn did. As I said when I started, he was at the top of his game. He was fully engaged. He was very, very happy. He was loving all aspects of his life. He was loving his children, and they were loving him. He was loving his grandchildren, and they were loving him. He was energized by his consulting practice, by his photography, by bird watching, skiing, and travel. He loved helping out my father and my mother of blessed memory. I think he even loved his Waldenstrom's disease and the opportunity it gave him to excel and to contribute in a new scientific arena. To Glenn, we are all heartsick that you have left us. We miss your stories, your adventures, your latest accomplishments. We miss that extra large, ever-present smile. Glenn, you went out at the top of your game, and we are all left wanting more. Rest in peace, big brother. May your memory be for a blessing.
Next, I'd like to invite up one of Glenn's good friends, Oliver Flint.
First, I'd like to thank Inge for inviting me to speak. You know, Glenn had a lot of friends, and to choose me was a great honor. So, I only have several pages here, so don't worry. When I first met Glenn, there was an instant rapport. Glenn always found it easy to make friends because he was interested in what people had to say and in what he could learn from you. He listened. In return, he rewarded you with stories of his adventures. He was always eager to encounter and explore new ideas. And what he learnt often blossomed into enthusiasms: cycling, photography, birding, even acupuncture. If the idea appealed, Glenn was open to try it. whether it was tubing down the Delaware, riding for hundreds of miles for charity, providing veterinary expertise to the sled dogs on the Iditarod, taking a break after a scientific meeting in Scandinavia to go on an island-hopping cycle ride with his daughter. My friend and Glenn's friend Evan Janowitz remarked that Glenn lived life to the fullest. Glenn's thirst for adventure as a young man eventually led to work for the Peace Corps in Ecuador. His stories of eating roast guinea pig, learning to plow with a team of oxen, I have a photograph of that he gave me, and sleeping in a communal bed with all the men of a Quechua tribe he visited, like a nest, as it were, that he visited, of being infected with a parasite and having to travel for hours on bus to find treatment, of catching malaria. These were all part of the great adventure. Glenn was ready to try anything. He immersed himself in the culture. He was ready to try any activity that helped him to grow and at the same time helped others. Monica and I have, my wife, Monica is over there, have delightful memories of our meals with Glenn and Inge, walking in the sculpture park after a meal at Rat's, a famous restaurant in New Jersey, or meeting in the Blue Moon Cafe in Lambertville. My own interest in birding and bird photography really grew when we shared Glenn's enthusiasm on trips to Cape May. Our trips were always enhanced by Inge's keen eye. She always spotted the bird first. Glenn and Inge were generous with gifts for Opie, our first grandson, when he visited with our daughter Olivia. Glenn and Opie were instant friends, foreshadowing Glenn as the world's best grandfather for his own grandchildren after they were born. He was a kind and gentle man. We worked in the same building in the Bristol-Myers Squibb Hopewell site. His office was 2 doors away from mine. They were wonderful, large offices. It was a tremendous disappointment to Glenn when, on the closure of the Hopewell site, he had to move with everyone else to the research center at Lawrenceville. Initially, the business trend was towards open offices. He was not enthusiastic. Eventually, small offices in the labs were created for the pathologists. For such an expansive soul, this must have been excessively constrictive. I think maybe this was among many other things, of course, that helped him decide to retire. After a very active academic career in Washington State, and prior to working for BMS, Glenn had worked for Pharmacia in Kalamazoo. From his stories, I think he enjoyed the work environment, but the company was purchased by Pfizer and the culture changed, so he moved with his family to the East Coast and BMS. Bruce, who's here also, Bruce Carr, who was our boss, writes that Glenn was pretty, I can't do the accent, Bruce, so. Glenn was pretty funny taking the mickey out of Pfizer. Apparently, they had a class on how Pfizer employees were supposed to greet colleagues at scientific meetings. Glenn would pull himself up to his full height, which is taller than me, puff out his chest, and assume his deepest voice. "Hello, I'm Glenn Cantor, and I work for Pfizer. We have an $8 billion R&D budget," at which Glenn, the literal humblest of men, would giggle a little. I hope. From the get-go, Glenn, as Evan Janowitz, our colleague, told me, endeavored to be fully networked. Evan says that Glenn was an amiable and gregarious man who was at ease with everyone who was prepared to meet him halfway. He spoke Spanish to the cleaners and immunology to the research groups. He was always making new associations with people and groups across the company. Evan told me that Glenn was always ultra-focused. He used his time extremely well, was very disciplined. He had many notebooks that were incredibly well organized. He took notes all the time that he could recover and keep track of. Now, if you'd ever visited Evan's office, you might think that he was just a little jealous of Glenn's organizational skills. Bruce wrote that many may not be aware of Glenn's professional accomplishments. Glenn, working together with toxicologist Rex Denton, it's a tongue twister, was instrumental in doing some unfortunate risk assessment work in which our development colleagues declared a drug deader than dead. Glenn and Rex pieced it together again and went on to be approved by the FDA as a fast-acting intranasal agent for migraine, Zavspret, now marketed by Pfizer. It was Glenn's intrigue with solving problems and his insight that marked his work. In one unusual case, he was puzzled by monkeys that were failing to thrive, losing weight, and suffering from diarrhea. He had been exploring acupuncture treatment, and as luck would have it, the husband of Fei Wang, one of our scientists, was a human pathologist who also practiced Chinese medicine and acupuncture. Glenn consulted and learned a technique that had some success with humans. Following sedation, he treated an animal, and remarkably, it improved almost overnight. Our colleague, Frédéric Moulin, wrote that regarding the monkeys with wasting syndrome, not only did he get their diarrhea treated with acupuncture, he convinced the veterinary staff in Hopewell to make a poster at the annual meeting of the American College of Laboratory Animal Medicine. Evan says that Glenn was fearless when he had a higher objective. While still at BMS, Glenn learned that he had Waldenström's macroglobulinemia, requiring occasional lengthy transfusions. He took this in his stride. The condition usually develops very slowly, so he did not allow it to slow him down. Instead, he enthusiastically tried to learn as much as he could and eventually became part of the Waldenström support community. Soon, he was reviewing grants for Waldenström's macroglobulinemia foundation. He was all in, as he was in everything he did. Now, I didn't have a chance to work directly one-on-one with Glenn on any scientific project, though he was always interested in what I was doing, and he's ready to offer ideas. So I'd like to end with some memories of those who worked with Glenn. This I got from his colleague Rex Denton, who I mentioned. He says, one of my favorite stories of Glenn highlights his ability to come out of the blue with unexpected scientific questions. At times, Glenn was 5 moves ahead of his colleagues in thinking about science. During one of the muckety-muck BMS town halls that featured the PD-L1 checkpoint inhibitor Opdivo, everyone was enamored with the utility of checkpoints in oncology. But the biological knowledge and underpinning of immune evasion, more associated with infection, was less broadly accepted. At the end of the clinical pitch, which went deep into several oncology areas, Glenn stood up and, to paraphrase, said, "Have you considered any indication for viral infections?" And the speaker, "Huh?" Glenn said, "I think that many viruses and pathogens cause upregulation of the target, you know. Infections, for example, that cause leprosy and warts." The speaker was incredulous and demurred. That would be an expensive and inconvenient wart therapy. And the audience laughed. Later, there was a large meet-up at a hotel bar where the entire site gathered. I was sitting with the Wallingford head, his name's Houston, and Mike Wiczkowski, you don't know, it doesn't matter who these people are, now oncology. And I think when Houston said, "Who was the crazy guy who asked that question about warts?" I said it was Glenn, and the guy is super knowledgeable. When Wiczkowski interrupted and said, "Well, it's not crazy at all. In fact, I studied that in response to malaria infection, and I think it might work for an incredible unmet need." The guy, Glenn, was brilliant, and I learned tons about the names and physical aerosol dynamics of the various nasal turbinates. All have their own anatomical name, apparently, from Glenn. His scientific and life experience was rich. He was a great man in addition to being a phenomenal scientist. He left a void for all who knew him. So this is from Evan Janowitz, who worked with him. There were dips and peaks at BMS, as in every business. One cycle had restrictions on travel, and typically all pathologists would attend an important national meeting, but under the new rule, it was cut right back, and so how would Glenn get to the next meeting? But at the AAVP meeting in Tucson, following Glenn's suggestion, he and Evan voted to save money by using one room for a week. And unfortunately, they got into terrible trouble for this, but they didn't care. So while attending the AAVP meeting in Denver, another meeting, he went whitewater rafting in Colorado, and he took all of the discovery toxicologists, pathologists with him. And then at the AAVP meeting in Vancouver, he went mountain biking, returning with terrifying stories of pathologists breaking limbs on the descent. Happily, he decided to get off the bike on the most difficult parts of the trail. Now, my friend Bruce Carr, I've saved some of his comments for last, and he should really be saying this, but maybe, okay. Glenn had a pathologist's quintessential tolerance for things gross. One time, we were around at the Cantors to give their red compost worms a try. These were near and dear to all our hearts, and occasionally I would feed them when Glenn was on vacation. He'd also feed their cat as well. So our cohort of worms went on for at least a decade till we left Pennington. Glenn was explaining the contents of mixed kitchen slops and shredded paper when he just rolled up his sleeves and plunged in his bare hands to his elbows to pull out a fistful of the wiggly devils and release an abundance of effluvia. While on things pathological, Glenn, by way of explaining his recent hip transplant, sent a photo of a grisly excised femoral head, complete with osteophytes and arthritic change. And I can add that during a colonoscopy that he described to me, his fearless thirst for new experience led him to ask the doc to leave him unsedated and turn the video monitor so he could see the view as the probe passed all the way up to the end of his colon. And honestly, I don't know how he could do that. But Bruce writes that in about 2009, I was apt as the head of discovery toxicology to set extracurricular objectives, one of which was to do a triathlon with me. And Glenn agreed to train. Not long after, Glenn started to swim with me in the Delaware River, which I tell you, it's not simple because it's a very fast river. So at least he wouldn't drown, and he could be counted on to slog out a decent bike and a run. Glenn and I trooped off to Round Reservoir one day. After a quarter-mile swim, a 10-mile hilly bike ride, and a 5K run later, we were all finished and very happy. And it wasn't the last of the small events we undertook together. One pact that once bore fruit was to participate in the Rosedale Park Turkey Trot, together for which we came away with an age group apple pie. Not a patch on Inga's creations, however. And these are my own final concluding remarks. So as Evan said, Glenn wanted to live his life to the fullest, take a big bite out of every experience. I learned a great deal from knowing Glenn, but I am sure that I hardly scratched the surface. He was a man much greater than the sum of parts we individually knew. To paraphrase Robert Burns from his poem Tam O'Shanter, kings may be blessed, but Glenn was glorious, o'er the hills of life victorious.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite up another one of Glenn's friends, Pina Cardarelli.
So when Inga asked me to prepare a eulogy for Glenn, I was both saddened and honored. I can't tell you how difficult it is for me to be up here talking about the memory of one of my dearest friends after his passing. He will be ever present for me, his family, and so many of us who knew and loved him. In 2009, the company I worked for was acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb. Very soon after the acquisition, I went to New Jersey and met Glenn. He came up to me and introduced himself with such kindness that I can never forget. I was feeling a bit overwhelmed, having been mostly at smaller biotech companies my entire career. Being one of the first people I met at BMS, his welcoming presence helped me ease into my new role. Bruce Carr, my mentor at BMS, who you've heard is present here today, certainly can attest to that relationship that we had. Glenn and I began working on many projects, and one of the things that impressed me the most was that he was so intelligent and thorough, and I was so impressed with his unique ability to clarify and simplify very complex scientific questions to anyone at any level that they would be able to understand. So from the onset, we had a special bond and friendship that would grow over time. Now, I know that this topic was also brought up by several others, but I just want to mention that one of his prominent traits was his big heart. His willingness to help others extended to his own challenges. When he was diagnosed with Waldenström, he took the opportunity to learn the disease, and he volunteered for the foundation, and he quickly became a reviewer of their grants and helping in their selection process and also in fundraising. We met at ASH last year where he was in fact there for that purpose. So when I was laid off from BMS in 2018, I went through a very rough time. I can be stereotypically an emotional Italian. Not an angry or verbose, but definitely emotional. Glenn was one of the people I could rely upon to calm me down. His support during that time was invaluable. Our talks were so important to my well-being. In February of 2020, he joined my current company, GPCR Therapeutics, as a consultant, where he worked with multiple teams. Glenn immediately made an impact as a scientist and a compassionate ally. His intelligence and demeanor made a huge difference for both of us, both our US site as well as our South Korea headquarters. In fact, we talked about him visiting Seoul to meet firsthand the staff. But before that, he was going to visit the US site and bring Inga. And they were going to come and stay at our house, and then he would meet the people at the US site. And sadly, that never happened because it was supposed to take place last March. I consider Glenn to be our extended family. We were fortunate to have him in the Bay Area during Hanukkah one year. So we lit candles, drank a little wine, and ate latkes. On the flip side, I am an immigrant to America, and I came from a small village in Italy when I was a child. And every August 7th, when we're not in Italy to do so, we celebrate La Festa di San Donato. On one year, when we were in the States, Glenn happened to be visiting. Having him be part of the celebration was such a joy. He relished it as much as I did. And every year on that day, he would send me a Buona Festa text message. That's how kind he was. During the fall of last year, my husband Jordan asked Glenn to read a manuscript for a book that he was working on. Not only did he provide excellent feedback, but he also provided Jordan the needed information about the process of photography to enhance the authenticity of the main character. Glenn's love for photography knew no bounds. His wonderful photographs of birds, as we heard, and nature spoke to that passion. Our adult children also knew the warmth of Glenn. Our daughter, Rebecca, spent a year studying in Argentina and Chile. She and Glenn spoke of his time in Ecuador. No doubt he had an impact on her decision. Glenn would be happy to know that Rebecca will be having her first child and our first grandchild at the end of August. Not only did Glenn relish in his children, their spouses, their grandchildren, but he would have been so happy for my family on what we're about to experience. And so in closing, it's still very hard to say goodbye to you, my dear, dear friend. You were one of the closest people I've ever had in my life. Though there will always be a hole in my heart from your loss, I'm a better person forever because of you. Goodbye, Glenn. Perhaps we'll meet up again wherever scientists venture in their next lives. Thank you.
Finally, I'd like to invite up one of Inga and Glenn's cousins, Duca.
Okay. Dear family and friends of Glenn, especially Inge and daughters. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Duke, Inge's first cousin. Together with my husband, Eric, we are the representatives of the Dutch branch of Inge's family. My mother, Dean, is the sister of Inge's father. She, almost 98 years old, but also the rest of the family sent their love to everyone here, and they're just as everybody of the family devastated by the loss of Glenn. We loved him all. So I also speak on behalf of them. I've taken some pictures with me, but it's impossible to show them here. I hope you will see them in the other room. The story about how I met Glenn starts, of course, with Inge. Although we were cousins, we didn't see each other very much when we were young. But then in 1979, she came to Utrecht, where I lived, and studied medicine, and Inge came for a veterinary medicine internship. She stayed for about 3 weeks with me, and we had so much fun together. I remember us dancing in the room on music. Well, it was really nice. She told me then that she had a boyfriend, Glenn, and that they were planning to get married the next year. There was only one little problem. Her parents said that Glenn was not the right husband for her, and that they shouldn't get married. But Inge wasn't going to listen to them, and she was going to marry him, however. And she invited me to come to the wedding, and I did, as a representative of my family. I was a bit nervous about meeting Glenn, and at that moment I still respected the opinion of my uncle and aunt, the parents of Inge. So I was very curious about Glenn. Was he really a terrible person, just like Inge's parents told everybody? And then I met Glenn, and he was such a nice, enthusiastic, intelligent, cheerful man. He made me feel at home immediately. He was interested in me and told a lot of stories about anything and everything. I had a wonderful time, and I was so glad that Inge didn't listen to her parents. She married the perfect man for her, and his family was wonderful too. And I feel so flattered because they asked me to be their witness. which was wonderful, but unfortunately it wasn't possible because I didn't have the American nationality. After this trip, we met each other sometimes when they came to the Netherlands, but in 1995 I came to America with my own family, and we stayed with each other for about 5 days in Oregon, where we went camping. And again, it was wonderful, and Glenn told all kinds of funny stories and took us on trips to the beach to look for whales and dolphins and to play with gigantic seaweed. I have a picture of Glenn throwing it around. And we went to a river where we found thousands of little frogs and more. Glenn was always making plans to entertain us. He advised us about the things we should visit after we left. So we saw redwood trees and Crater Lake, and we loved it. Glenn looked after his mother, always planning trips and putting up ideas about how to spend your life. All our meetings after the trip were frequently reminisced, and Glenn always told the story that when we arrived at the camping place, Haroon, my son, who was 5 years old, was still asleep in the car, and we left him there. We were nearby and thought that we would notice when he woke up, but we didn't, and after a short time, someone came with Haroon to ask if he belonged to us, because he came to them, and they couldn't understand him, and they heard us talking some strange language, so they supposed we were the parents. We felt really guilty, but Glenn, even after years, thought it was a good joke. I'm not going to talk about every time we met. I'll just mention some highlights, otherwise this will last for hours. Once Glenn visited us on his own. He was here for a job. He went by train and was really surprised because we had a very weird train, which he thought was a snail train. And he said, "Why do you have slow trains?" I explained it was a snel train, which means fast train. Then he understood and he laughed about it a lot. Once I visited Inge and Glenn on my own for a week when they lived in New Jersey. The first day I was there, they took me cleaning the surroundings as they were volunteering. He always was doing that kind of things. I just started birding that time, and I had brought my binoculars with me, and Glenn was excited about that. And so Inge bought him binoculars for his birthday, and he was so happy with it. A highlight was their visit to us in 2014, together with Alida, when Eric and I got married. It was great. Glenn made wonderful pictures, and Alida invited us to come to their wedding the following year, which we did, and it was so nice. And they came to Dean's 90th birthday, and there Inge said they loved being in our family. And Dean said, "Well, you belong to this family now." And Glenn said, "So we are adopted?" And Dean said, "Yes." And last year, Inge and I visited us twice. First in April to visit the Keukenhof. Inge wanted to show Glenn all the wonderful blooming flower bulbs. And together we visited the whole family and went birding together. He went bicycling too, I forgot to tell, but I thought Glenn was really a good bicyclist, but in our traffic it was terrible. I think he almost 3 times had an accident. Sorry. And Glenn told he loved it much. And that time we talked about this disease, Waldenstrom. And I told him I had a patient with the same disease, and she died at the age of 92. And Glenn was so happy to hear that. He was told that he wouldn't die of it, and this was a confirmation that he could get old. He was still so active, he was still working well, you know all that, of course. And in September, they visited us again when we stayed with the whole family, 30 persons in a large house. And Glenn talked with a lot of us. He was so interested in everyone. Afterwards, he apologized for the fact that he hadn't talked with everyone. And there, Eric and I said that we were planning to visit them next year, and Glenn was so excited. He was trying to learn Dutch for a long time already, but the only thing he learned with the free course he followed was how to order all kinds of food. After that, he was going to be a bit more fanatic, and when on Tuesday, January 30, We announced that we were coming the end of May. He was so happy he sent me a picture of the garden with a beautiful sunrise and on WhatsApp with a Dutch text. I have a picture of that. It is wonderful. And we got an email with all kinds of plans for the holiday. But first they went to Alaska, and the internet would be bad there. But after their trip, we would go on making plans. And then Alida sent a WhatsApp on February 17 to tell what happened, and time stood still. And now Eric and I are here, the same period we had planned to visit Inge and Glenn. And we are sad, so sad. We miss Glenn, we miss his stories, his kindness, his enthusiasm, his cheerfulness, his smartness. I know how he loved his children and his grandchildren. He was so proud of them. They will miss him even more. But he lives on in his children and grandchildren. And we will support Inge because we love her very much too. And we'll remember Glenn forever.
When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words, unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality, bound to them, takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses, restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed, they existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. We're going to conclude our service today with two traditional Jewish prayers. The first one's called El Malei Rachamim, which I'll chant in Hebrew and then translate into English. The second is called Mourner's Kaddish, our prayer that we say in memory of a loved one who's passed away. There were cards that you may have grabbed when you walked in along with the program. So if you want to read along for Mourner's Kaddish, you are welcome to do that. If you're able, I invite you to please rise. El Malei Rachamim Shochem B'Ramim Hamsem Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashlina Im Kedoshim Utorim Kezohar Rakia Mazirim En Nishmat Gamliel Ben Baruch V'Yudit Shalach Leolamo Barachamim Yastirechu Besedek Kanafav Leolamim Vitzor HaChaim En Nishmato Adonai Hu Nachalato Ve'anuach b'shalom ha'mishkavo v'nomar amen. Compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to Glenn Cantor, who has entered eternity. O God of mercy, let him find refuge in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. God is his inheritance, and may he rest in peace. And together we say, Amen. Join together in the words of Mourner's Kaddish. Yikadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah, ve'alma divrach yotei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayed kol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'yisman kariv imru. Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alam ulamei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekudsha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechamata, da'amiram be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mamav, hu yaseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mamav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, ve'imru. Amen. May the one who provides comfort to those who are bereaved be a source of comfort to us all. We say together, Amen. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to invite everybody to join us in the social hall, which you can get to by going through these doors, taking a right. There's bathrooms. And once everyone has a chance to grab some food and be seated, we'll open up and give others an opportunity to share. Thank you.